Hello, this video is an introduction to the narrative books in the New Testament and the implications for putting a date on them. This will really be part one of two. Let me share my screen. Okay, dating the narrative books. This is obviously a picture of Jesus on Palm Sunday. The first five books of the New Testament are primarily consisting of narratives. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels, and Acts. Now, there's some connections. Most obvious connection of all is Luke and Acts go together. Those two books will be the first that I will try to put a date on when I do, but I'm not going to do that in this video because first I have to talk about the synoptic Gospels. But the connection between Luke and Acts are obvious. They have the same author, it's Luke. The same recipient, a fellow named Theophilus. Theophilus means friends of God, and some people have suggested that maybe it's not one specific person named Theophilus, but just for anyone who's a friend of God. But whichever it is, the point is it's the same recipient. And it's clear that Luke was written first and Acts second. Probably they were very close in time together, so not much time went between the two being written. And this connection is obvious and simple, and that's why I'm going to do it first. Just to read the first verses, which make it pretty clear. Luke 1-4 says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, having delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." And then Acts 1, verses 1 and 2 says, "In the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day when he was taken up." So obviously, Acts 1 says in the first book is Luke, and the second book is Acts. But now let's talk about the synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic or same-eye Gospels. So synoptic means same eye. So while Luke has a connection with Acts, it also has a connection with Matthew and Mark. Now, John is different of the four Gospels. John, although it has countless similarities with the synoptic Gospels, the witness comes from like a completely different witness. He doesn't make any effort to match or copy the wording with the other three, and many stories are completely different. And I believe that John was written last. So I'm going to set John aside and do the other Gospels first, and then we'll come back and talk about a date for John. For the synoptic Gospels, the fact that they're connected is very obvious, but the explanation of exactly how they're connected is not simple. Matthew, Mark, and Luke share many stories. The wording often matches exactly. The examples are very, very numerous. Let me show you one here. Like I said, I have very numerous examples. Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I am willing, be cleansed." And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Mark says, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. And Luke said, and he stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I am willing, be cleansed." And immediately the leprosy left him. So just looking at those three, you can see the connection is very obvious. They're not quite identical. They're all three just a little bit different, but they're so close that you know that one person was reading the other or something like that. Now the connection between the Gospels between Matthew and Mark is a little bit stronger than Matthew and Luke or Mark and Luke. In other words, Luke stands a little bit different from the other two. The connection between the Gospels is literary and not oral. I think that's probably important because there's been a fair amount written on oral tradition in the New Testament, that the idea that the gospel stories were passed down from one person to another, you know, I never much liked that, the idea that this was being passed down like from a telephone game. And in my study and the way I'm going to present these slides, that wouldn't really be realistic because I have pretty early dates for these gospels when many eyewitnesses were still alive, including the apostles. And so I don't have a whole lot of use, honestly, for oral tradition, but also to point out the fact that the connection is literary. I want to read you one other passage. I'm not necessarily going to read all these three, but these are three in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when Jesus is talking about his discourse about the end of time and about the destruction of Jerusalem. And so this is what he says, but let me highlight something. There in red, in Matthew and Mark, he says, let the reader understand. Now, Jesus is actually talking to his disciples. He's not writing a letter. So when Jesus is talking to his disciples, Jesus doesn't really say to his disciples, let the reader understand. Instead, Jesus is talking, in the little parenthetical phrase, let the reader understand, was inserted by the person who wrote the gospel. It was inserted by Matthew and Mark, or maybe Mark did it first and Matthew copied, or you could go the other way. But the point is, that's a parenthetical statement about a reader. And so the connection, not only do they use the exact same words, but it's talking about a reader. So it's not verbally copied, it's copied by reading and writing. So to address this, there's a couple theories. The two-source theory is the one that I want to talk about first, because this is really the most common one and most widely taught. And I don't think it's quite right. However, it has several valid points and some things we can learn from it. So let's talk about the two-source theory. First of all, it stipulates that Mark was the earliest gospel. Mark wrote first. And that Matthew and Luke copied from Mark. And in addition, Matthew and Luke used an additional source of Jesus' sayings that they call Q for the word quell, and means sayings. So the idea is that Mark doesn't have so many sayings. Mark has more narratives, and Matthew and Luke would have used those, but for all the additional sayings which are present in both Matthew and Luke, they would have come from Q. And if you draw it, it looks like that. So Mark is first, and Matthew and Luke both use it. And then there's Q, and Matthew and Luke both use that. Of course, we don't have any record of Q, but it's a hypothetical document which doesn't exist anymore. The two-source theory assumes that Mark was the first gospel, and some evidence for that. Almost all the accounts in Mark appear in either Matthew or Luke. There's very, very little in Mark that doesn't show up in one of the others. Matthew and Luke never really agree against Mark on a question of sequence. In other words, sometimes the way things are put in order in the different gospels is not the same, but if there's never a case where Matthew and Luke have the same order and then Mark disagrees with both of them combined. Now, I probably should say about those first two lines of evidence that doesn't at all really prove a two-source theory. It's a useful observation, but it doesn't, there's other explanations. For example, on that second one, if Mark was in the middle, you could say Matthew wrote first and Mark used Matthew, and then Luke used Mark, and it would have had the same effect. I'm not saying that that's what happened either, but what I'm saying is that there's other explanations for those things. Mark names some people who were not well-known individuals, like Bartimaeus, Alexander and Rufus, and Salome. And the idea is that maybe those people were still alive when Mark wrote, so those were well-known individuals who could be called on to be eyewitnesses to verify his account. But then maybe they weren't around for the time that Matthew and Luke wrote. And Mark has more difficult wording than Matthew or Luke. I'll explain what that means in a minute. And finally, there's what they call dualisms. There's a lot more that's written on this than just that. Whole forests have been cut down to write papers explaining ideas about the synoptic issue, but that's a summary of some of the main ideas that have been suggested. On difficult wording, let me explain what that means. Mark 6:5 says about Jesus, and he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. That's Jesus has gone back to his hometown. But that wording is a little bit of a problem because it makes it sound like Jesus was not able to do something, which doesn't sound quite right for the Son of God. I mean, he's all powerful, but he couldn't do it. So when you read that, I mean, we can explain that, but we can sort of explain what Mark meant, but it's just the way that it's worded sounds, that's what you would call a difficult wording. And when you have the same account in Matthew, it says, and he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Essentially, it says the same thing, but the wording in Matthew is much easier. It doesn't give us any heartburn at all. Now, if one gospel is using the other, then what will happen is you tend to go from a difficult wording to an easier wording. You're not going to go from an easier wording and then have the person who like copies the easier thing create something that's more difficult. That wouldn't be the normal way for it to happen. Or here's another one. Mark 4:38, they're in the boat and there's a storm and the disciples are worried and they say, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Well, that's pretty harsh. I'm sure that more than one disciple had different things to say because the others' gospels worded a little different. "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." Or "Master, Master, we are perishing." Those aren't harsh. It's that one in Mark it's a little bit harsh. So those are examples of what we would call difficult wording. Mark has more of that. And dualisms. Dualisms are a case when Mark says two things, they both kind of mean the same thing, and Matthew and Luke each pick one of them, but they pick different ones. Like here, Mark says, when it was evening after sunset, and Matthew says, when it was evening, and Luke says, as the sun was setting. So see, they pick different ones. Or Mark said, the leprosy left him and he was cleansed, and Matthew said, his leprosy was cleansed, and Luke says, the leprosy left him. Now, here's some problems with a two-source theory. First of all, Matthew and Luke obviously have plenty of unique material. So it wouldn't have come from Q because only one of them has it. Like Luke has the parable of the prodigal son, and Matthew has several parables of the kingdom of God that aren't in Luke or Mark. So because that's a problem, some people have suggested the four-source theory, which looks like the two-source theory, except you add in M as an extra source for Matthew and L as an extra source for Luke. So, but other than M and L, it's the same sort of thing. Mark is still first, and then there's also Q. Now, there's problems with the two or four-source theory. For example, one of the main ones is really what they call Matthew and Luke minor agreements, like this passage. Mark says, and some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, prophesy. And Matthew says, then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you? And Luke says, they also blindfolded him and kept asking him, prophesy. Who is it that struck you? Well, in this case, both Matthew and Luke say, who is it that struck you? But they didn't get that from Mark. And so that's what's called a minor agreement between Matthew and Luke. And actually, there's a lot of them. So that's kind of a problem for the two-source theory or the four-source theory. So a conclusion about this is that the relationship between the synoptic gospels is complex. I'm not willing to embrace any kind of simple solution that says this is exactly how it happened. Any of the theories that people have come up with, they sound good until you get into the details. And then once you get into the details, it seems like you can pick all kinds of holes into them. And I've only named two of the most common. There are a number of other theories, like it's pretty common to suggest that Matthew was written first and that the other Gospels use Matthew, and pretty much almost every combination you can think of has been suggested by somebody. It's easier to critique a theory than to create one. But nevertheless, in my next video, I am going to suggest perhaps a different way that it happened. It's a little bit different. But regardless of which theory or which idea you buy into, or even if you're not sure you can buy into any, that would be completely understandable to say that it's just too complicated and we can't really know. That would be fine if that's where you end up. But one thing that is clear is that there's a strong connection between the synoptic gospels. Those are, I mean, they are definitely connected in some way, and that connection is literary. So those things are pretty clear. In the next video I'll try to explain a little bit more of a idea of how I think the synoptic gospels came to be written and developed in the way that they were developed. And I'll start back in on Luke and Acts, because that seems to be a clear and kind of obvious connection between those two books. And also, it is one of the cases where it ought to be fairly obvious what the date is. So that'll be in my next video. Thank you for watching.